Welcome to today's webinar on the Asia Pacific Wireless Approvals Overview. We hope you're enjoying your summer and we're pleased that you take time to join us today. Washington Labs is a radio frequency testing laboratory. We also focus on product safety, machinery, and environmental. We're an independent private laboratory. We've been around since 1989, have performed something like 15,000 projects for various companies in the technology space. Today's agenda, we'll have a wireless market overview, talk a little bit about global wireless market trends, talk about APEC makeup, and then focus on specific markets and wireless approvals requirements for those markets. I want to give some perspective on the growth of the wireless industry. American certification body has been certifying devices since 1999. We've seen a tremendous growth in this sector. Of course, this is apparent in all of our lives as more and more things go wireless. So over the 10 years from 2005 to 2015, FCC certifications grew by a factor of about 5.1, from about 3,000 in 2005 to over 15,000, and that's growing ever steadily. Europe experienced similar growth as well as Asia. So on average, about a 5 times growth rate globally. So more and more wireless devices are placed on the market every year. I'd like to point out one particular interesting point. In that same time period, China growth rate was 26 times from 2004 to 2014. These are devices that were certified from Chinese grantees. This is a tremendous amount of growth, and it's really pulling a lot of globalization, wireless globalization, and standardizations into our industry. But the area we're interested in right now is what's called the Asia Pacific region. Now, it's defined as all these countries or economies that are in the Asia Pacific area, and it accounts for about more than 4 billion people, a majority of the people on the planet, if you think about it. So it's a large market, and it's a subset of the Asia Pacific community. There's what's called the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Now, these are economies that touch the Pacific Ocean, and I'll draw attention to that particular word a little bit later. But these are any of the countries that touch the Pacific Ocean. And one of the goals of APEC is a regional economic forum that was established about 30 years ago to leverage the growing interdependence of the Asia Pacific markets. So the overall goal of the 21 members is to really improve security, improve trade, improve communication, and as they say, secure growth by accelerating regional economic integration. So APEC covers a lot of different regions, sectors, one of them being the telecommunications sector. And in the telecommunications sector, there's what's called a mutual recognition arrangement. We call this the APEC TEL MRA. And under the mutual recognition arrangement, it's a phased-in approach which allows countries or economies to exchange data for the purpose of conformity assessment. So this has been quite a successful way, and it's quite a good route for many companies that want to place their products into the APEC market. So phase 1 of the APEC TEL MRA is exchange of test data. This means that recognized laboratories in different economies are allowed to submit test reports into the certification organizations in a target country. Phase 2 means that we have full certification exchange between the two countries. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So some of the MRA benefits are primarily to eliminate the need for redundant testing and/or certification. And it also has created a great stakeholder organization that exchanges a lot of information about standards, processes, market surveillance, and other important topics in the conformity assessment world. APEC TEL MRA supporters are these 20 countries' economies here. The United States participates with APEC TEL Phase 1 with Australia, Canada, Chinese Taipei, Hong Kong, China, Malaysia, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam. And we have full Phase 2 certification exchanges with Canada, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore, and Japan. Japan should be on that list, and that's been important. So that means that certification bodies in these mutual countries can perform evaluations and perform certifications for those agreeing countries. Now, I'll point out Hong Kong, China does not mean Hong Kong and China. It means basically Hong Kong. And so there's a little bit of politics involved there, obviously, if people are aware of. And we also call Taiwan, the country of Taiwan, Chinese Taipei. And again, this is a political reality of our current state of play in the world politics. So I'm going to focus on the following 6 economies here: Japan, which we have phase 2 relationship; Hong Kong, phase 2; Singapore, phase 1; South Korea, phase 1; Taiwan, and Vietnam. So typically the regulatory compliance schemes involve radio, electromagnetic compatibility, and product safety, including RF safety, or SAR, or maximum permissible exposure. That's important for mobile devices and portable devices and radio devices in general. The first country we'll touch base with is Japan. And I started with Japan because it's really been a very successful implementation of the phase 2 APEC TEL MRA. It means that ACB and other certification bodies can perform the full evaluation and issue certificates under the Japanese regulations. The authority in Japan is the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, MIC. Under the MIC is TELEC, which runs the certification program for MIC. And there's another party or organization called the Association of Radio Industries and Business, ARIB, and they write and do some interpretation of specifications. So until approximately 15 or so years ago, TELEC was the only route that you could go to get a certification for Japan, either inside Japan or anywhere. So the regulators sort of liberalized things about the same time as the FCC, which created the TCB program and created recognized certification bodies. So in the beginning of that, or for quite a while, Japan and the United States did not have implementation of phase 2 MRA. Well, this changed a few years ago when NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies, and MIC got together and finally hammered out the arrangements to allow full certification in the United States industry. So this allows the mutual recognition agreement, allows for formation of RCBs in the US for Japan certification. And they basically have parallel regulations and similar technical rules that allow certification testing and certification processes to occur in the United States. The scopes of the US-Japan MRA include terminal equipment. These are things that you plug into the wall, and radio equipment from licensed to unlicensed devices. So there are 4 main classes of products in Japan radio law. License-free, these are low power, very low power devices, and I'll explain that in a moment. Unlicensed devices such as Bluetooth, cordless phones, Wi-Fi devices, keyless entries, remote alarms, those kinds of things that are typically less than a watt. Then the case is licensed devices such as cellular cell phones and base stations and the type. And the 4th kind is so-called special, and these are devices that only MIC can approve. One particular example that we run into is a 13.56 megahertz RFID, which has greater than a certain amount of power. Those devices have to be certified through MIC. So the regulations and specifications, the top one is the so-called Japan Radio Law, number 131, and it's more or less a procedure, and I'd say it's akin to part 2 of the FCC rules. Underneath the Japan Radio Law, you have the ordinances, the actual technical requirements. And then you can have another resource under TELEC, which has a summary of technical requirements, and as I mentioned before, the ARIB standards are English translations, unofficial now, of some of the procedures for doing testing. You always have to follow the technical requirements in the ordinances, and I'll get into some of the testing particulars in a moment. So this is a summary of the articles, Article 38 particularly, and Article 38.31 and 38.3-32 talk about the recognized certification body process. Now, as an overview of transmitter certification, Chapter 3 of the radio law has the regulations and conformity assessment processes. And then there's a number of ordinances and procedures that you have to file. And I'll point out a particular interesting tool that we found useful in our work. It's an RF database that allows us to kind of plumb into what the summary of the requirements are, because my Japanese is not very good. So ultimately, the assessment is performed by a CAB, Conformity Assessment Body, as they're known in Japan, or a recognized certification body, as they're known outside of Japan. Now, associated with the Japanese certification is a particular number that's issued by the CAB or the RCB. And on a regular basis, we have to notify to MIC the equipment type number and test report into their system. Ultimately, it gets listed on a MIC database, and you can search that database and come up with the numbers and whose the certificate was issued to. There's 3 categories in the Japan radio law. Category 1, unlicensed station, they call them radio. Licensed station, this would be like a blanket license for, similar to what happens in the United States, so where the carriers get a license. And the classes that would apply to that are mobile phones, as we're familiar with. The other type of category is licensed stations, which is other types, which include things like base stations and higher power, typically fixed installations, where you have to have a license in order to operate on that spectrum. It's not unlike what happens in the United States under Part 15 for unlicensed devices, Part 90, Part 22 for licensed stations, and then also for the licensed stations for fixed installations. Now, there is one very curious category of equipment where the certification is exempt. These are called very low power transmitters. And if your device, 3-meter radiated emissions fall below this particular line, you don't have to do anything. You have to test, but there's no certification procedure. This is quite a different departure from, say, FCC or Industry Canada or ISED, where they require a certification for anything that intentionally emits. So under Japan radio law, for specified radio equipment, and that's the terminology they use, Item 1 of the radio law allows foreign certification bodies to carry out assessment to mixed standards or comparably equal standard methods. So in the Japan industry or community, the notion of accreditation really doesn't come into play at all. Sort of the community is well known, and MIC will accept test results from laboratories that meet a certain criteria of competence, but there's no formal accreditation. It's unlike the United States, where accreditation is necessary to submit test reports to certification bodies. And so during the wrangling of the Phase 2 implementation, there was a lot of questions about how do you prove that there's conformance to the Japan radio technical regulations. And so what came out is that sort of an equivalence table has been built up that can match the certain Japan radio test procedures to, say, ANSI or ETSI type of procedures. It's a classification of radio equipment out of the radio law. There's 104 items, and so you can click on this and look at where does your equipment fall in, and you would find a particular clause that applies. I mentioned a third-party resource. There's a handy tool called the RF database by DSP Research out of Japan. And what they've done is they've put together a compilation and summary of the technical requirements for various devices. And it's a subscriber-based system, yearly fee, but it's quite handy. And what we can do with this is to plug in a frequency, say 2400 megahertz, and as you would imagine, lots of devices there. And then what you get is a summary of the requirements and what the specifications need to be. So it's a great little tool. So you can search by frequency, and around 900 megahertz, for example, there's a tolerance of plus or minus 100 megahertz. The database returns all these different summaries of the requirements for devices. So this is handy to find out, number one, what frequencies are allowed, and their use, as well as the summary of the technical requirements. Japan has the modular approvals. It's not called modular approvals, it's called independent of host. And you can certify a module as long as you satisfy the following conditions, where you have an integrated antenna, a high frequency filter section, modulation section, auxiliary equipment such as an indicator and a control section. So it's really pretty much the same thing as the FCC modular approvals. Let's move over to Hong Kong. Let's list Hong Kong, China, but Hong Kong. The authority there is the Office of Communications Authority, or OFCA. And under their scheme, they have the Hong Kong Telecom Equipment Evaluation and Certification Scheme, HKTEC. And there's two options. One is voluntary certification and compulsory certification. Now, you don't have to certify your device in Hong Kong. You can if you want. It may be a marketing thing or it may be a customer need, but it's not necessary for most equipment. There's some exemptions. But even things like mobile phones or Bluetooth devices, the voluntary certification scheme is satisfactory. Now, most equipment that qualifies for the voluntary scheme, but you have to meet the technical regulations. You're not exempt from doing some evaluation, however you do that. But you may decide that your equipment meets FCC or European norms, and you satisfied that maps out against the Hong Kong standards. So you do have to do a little bit of work, but you don't need to officially certify it. Equipment that must comply with the compulsory scheme are high power transmitters that are also subject to licensing. So these would be, say, cellular base stations or broadcast stations or point-to-point links, things that effectively have to carry a license to operate. And to get that, if you want to go through any certification, you go to a certification body either in Hong Kong or abroad, because between the United States and Hong Kong, we have phase 2 agreement that allows US firms to certify equipment directly. And so some of these things that are required for compulsory certification scheme include things like I just mentioned, base stations, radio equipment for GSM, paging equipment. You know, these are all fixed location type devices that have some bit of power and are licensed. The list of voluntary certification scheme equipment is here, and it's pretty much the rest of everything else, including mobile phones, LTE devices, antenna amplifiers, RFID equipment, and you can see they use both the US and European bands for that. And other telecommunications apparatus such as low power cordless phones, etc., Bluetooth, and unlicensed devices in the 2, 4, and 5 gigahertz range. So under the Hong Kong scheme, the recognized testing or certification agencies, RTAs, are ISO accredited testing agencies. They can also are EU notified bodies are allowed, US TCBs under the TEL MRA, and CBTLs under IECEE scheme. The accreditation, however, must be to the relevant Hong Kong OFCA standards. Now, there's a lot of great information, English language, and these are the links to there, and the references in the standards database are under the first link, and I'll send out the PDF of this presentation so you can get the links directly. The actual scheme procedures in the second link, and the RF certifications procedures in the third link. Now we'll go a little bit north to South Korea, and the authority there is the National Radio Research Agency, or NRRA. Under the South Korean conformity assessment system, there's 3 options depending on the type of equipment. The highest level is a certification of conformity, and this is a formal submission according to Korean standards and formal approval through the Radio Research Agency, or RRA. The other level is something that's not subject to COC, so that's a lower level. And the interim of conforming and something that does not directly conform with Korean standards. So these might be devices that are a special use case, and you have to go through the RRA for that. In order to gain a certificate of conformity, you have to submit the usual thing, user's manuals, test report issued by an authorized testing agency or the testing agency in an MRA country. So this is interesting because you can submit test data or use test data for certain types of things, particular EMC, for Korean approval. You don't have to test in Korea. However, there are radio devices you have to do in-country testing. So examples of this are wireless telephone, receivers, radar equipment, modems, etc. So non-transmitter equipment, basically, except for the radars. In Singapore, the IMDA, the Info Communications Media Development Authority, there's a guide for registration of telecom equipment. Again, this is an excellent resource if you're going into Singapore. English language research laid out pretty sanely. And these smaller economies, such as Singapore, they're not going to create, their new technical requirements. They're going to typically adopt international standards. There's 4 types of registration. So certification is not required. It's a registration process. So if you're putting something into Singapore, you have to go online and you have to register. And there's 4 different routes here: the enhanced simplified equipment registration, the simplified equipment registration, general equipment registration, and the application for COC. So there's a table in that guide that lists out all the different types of equipment and where the application has to be. It's an online submission, and the general requirements in order to get into Singapore and be properly registered is you have to have a local entity and a licensed telecommunications dealer. So if you're not inside Singapore, you have to find a local partner basically and have them licensed as a telecommunications dealer. So the validity and cost and application processing time of these 4 different routes depend on the type of equipment and the registration. But the typical documentation are the things that you normally expect: pictures, descriptions, technical specifications, and then a supplier's declaration of conformity signed by the licensee. These are the categories of equipment that was previously referred to. So if you have something like a land mobile radio, you have a registration fee of $350, and then the technical specifications are in the right-hand column. Many of these things have been harmonized, as I mentioned before, with international standards. And as you look through this list, you can see different types of equipment, and so you have to determine where your product fits in order to find out what kind of scheme you would be using. So for example, short-range, low-power devices, RFID, radio detection, Bluetooth devices. There's the enhanced scheme is not available. The general equipment scheme is optional, and if you want to register, you have to, under that scheme, you have to pay a fee of $350, for example. So this is that type of equipment that does not require any equipment registration. So these are, basically non-transmitter equipment, telephones, auto dialers, answering machines, these types of things. The standards, as I mentioned before, are all based on international standards. They'll accept IEC, 3GPP, CISPR, ETSI, etc. And again, the link to all these standards is on the page here. Again, we'll send this out. Radio-specific standards are all listed on that link, and there's quite a detailed list, and it's pretty easy to navigate. And for example, here I took just a quick page out of this. The IMDA TS-IoT, which was published in November 2017, has technical specifications for Internet of Things. And of course, IoT is a hot topic these days. But you can go through the list and find out what type of device you have, and then find out what particular requirements apply to your device. Now, moving up to Taiwan, or as I call it, Chinese Taipei. The background on that is when Taiwan used to be recognized as China a number of years ago, and during the political changes and China's rise, there was a pressure to not recognize Taiwan as China and recognize China, the People's Republic of China, as China. So in order to keep people's under the APEC TEL organization, we call it Taiwan Chinese Taipei. But the authority there is the National Communications Commission, or NCC. And they have a certification program for controlled telecommunications RF devices, or CTRFDs. And these devices must be tested to the telecom technical regulations, again, quite similar to the United States, for example. And the application report and supporting documentation, the usual stuff, gets sent to the certification body. And only recognized CB can certify CTRFDs. And there's only one foreign recognized CB, which happens to be NEMCO Canada. So in order to get a certification in Taiwan, you have to submit the device. Practically, you have to submit it to a Taiwan authority, Taiwan certification body. The radio regulations, many of the NCC regulations really mirror the FCC specs. And again, the link is here. If you look through this, it almost reads exactly like FCC Part 15 in terms of frequency bands as well as technical requirements. So this is just a short excerpt of the type of regulations that are in that particular document. And you can see it has the usual things such as various frequencies, callouts. RFID is under 3.2, so that's an exact match for RFID in the United States. Then under 3.10, that's an exact match for the unlicensed bands in Part 15C. So under the APEC authority, Taiwan is a phase 1 in the United States under APEC TEL MRA. So recognized labs under phase 1 can submit reports to Taiwan certification bodies, and the detailed information is on this link here. The actual certification bodies that are approved are all in Taiwan, except that one I mentioned in Canada. So these are large and sophisticated certification, test and certification organizations, typically around the Taipei area. Now, the Chinese national standards is a separate set of standards that apply to non-radio equipment, pretty much. Under the BSMI, the Bureau of Standards Metrology and Inspections, which is a bit like might be ANSI in the United States, they administer the national standards for Taiwan. There's many sectors, from oil, gas to materials, performance, construction, you name it, about 14,000 different standards. And under one of the sectors there is a BSMI for EMC and safety. For radio devices, labeling is required. You have to have the NCC mark and the certificate number that's issued by the certification body. Local rep is required, and the certificate's valid for 5 years. Now we'll finish up with a brief introduction for Vietnam. The authority is the Ministry of Information and Communications, and under that is the Authority of Telecommunications. So a summary, the Asia Pacific region is big. We're seeing more activity of people trying to apply products overseas. The interesting trade situation has changed the outlook a little bit between the US and China. And so what some people are doing is looking for other markets, and part of this is getting certification. Now, in general, global standards typically apply. So in many cases, there shouldn't have to be a need for any drastic redesign if you're going to submit something for certification. Phase 1 labs, TEL MRA situation may help. In a lot of cases, it may not be practical. And really, what the laboratories, if you're a lab out there and you're in a phase 1, you want to apply that and do testing for your client. Really, the practical thing is to make a relationship with a certification body or laboratory in the other country. So that may mean you have to get on an airplane sometimes. Phase 2, where the system has matured enough where certifications are able to be done in the partner countries, very slow to implement. There's a lot of pushback from some of our APEC TEL MRA partners because it's giving up a little bit of business, frankly. So it's an economic issue, not so much a technical issue. And one note is China, the US has been trying fervently for years to try to get China to come to the APEC TEL table. And although they're a signatory of the thing, the implementation is on a bilateral basis or a country-to-country basis. And China, for various reasons, has been very reluctant to try to move into that even phase one between the United States and China. And a lot of that has to do with the testing infrastructure and other protectionist measures, if I can make a little editorial on that coming out of the PRC. So that's it. That was just a quick overview, and I hope there was some content that was useful. I'd like to thank everyone for their time. My contact information is here, so feel free to follow up by email. So anyway, everybody have a great day. Hope you're successful and enjoy the rest of the summer. Thank you.